There are 3 presentations. I will start first, and then the Peterborough study would follow, and then I will speak again because Leena Augimeri sends her special regards. She couldn't come to Stockholm because of a competing important occasion, so I will present her presentation. And then Professor Lösel will be the discussant, so I think we should really move on then. Okay, so my presentation is not up here yet. There it is, very good, thank you so much. This is totally beyond my control, as you can see. Okay, so my name is Rolf Loeber. I'm a professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and I'm going to talk mostly about the Pittsburgh Girls Study, and I'll explain to you in a moment what this study is all about. So, gender differences are well known, and I'm not going to rehearse them to you. But there's much less known about the developmental differences as gender differences emerge over time, and that's really what the focus is of my presentation. But as you realize, studies on girls are way behind studies on boys, and the question then is, how to set up a study on girls. Should you have a very large one or the same one as with boys? And what should you measure over time? So this focus on girls is not just a question about who becomes delinquent or who becomes a frequent offender. It's also, of course, true, as you heard this morning at the discussion with the minister, girls become mothers, most of them, and will rear the next generation of youth, some of whom will become delinquent. So the knowledge about girls is really impaired because most of the longitudinal studies that I'm familiar with have relatively small n's, and so that makes it much more difficult to understand really what is going on for girls. And these small n's basically impair statistical power, and so in order to understand delinquency in girls that is of a lower prevalence than boys as a rule, you need to have a larger sample in order to get sufficient statistical power. So I'm going to report today about the first book that we have written about the Pittsburgh Girls Study, and I'll tell you about the study in a moment. I just want to acknowledge Wesley Jennings, particularly Leah Honan, Alex Picaro, and David Farrington, which is basically the first United States book on the development of offending in girls. So the topics for today, girls' development of problem behavior and delinquency. We're also interested in non-delinquent problem behaviors. Second, girls' criminal careers. Third, the developmental types, particularly trajectory analysis. And the fourth topic is gender differences in developmental trajectories. And then fifth topic, girls' contact with the justice system. The whole issue about self-reports versus official records and how many offenses are actually committed outside of the purview of the justice system. And the last topic is high offending and early onset girls. So we're really looking at the differences between girls. So gender differences are fine, but actually we should look much more at the differences between different groups of girls, and that's really the focus of the last presentation, or the last topic. So the Pittsburgh, as some of you might know, is a former steel city in Pennsylvania. And my wife and I were very happy to, after studying boys for many years, to eventually get substantial funding to study girls. And But we were faced with the problem of where to find girls in the Pittsburgh community. So we created a database of addresses, and then we did sample neighborhoods, and we oversampled the more problematic neighborhoods. In 1 year's time, we contacted over 100,000 households. This is necessary because there's no registry population registry in US cities such as Pittsburgh. So we couldn't really find the girls within records. We had to go and knock on doors and actually find out where girls of a certain age were living. So eventually, and this is at the bottom of this picture, oh, sorry, eventually we recruited 2,451 girls and their parents to participate in the study. That's almost 2,500 girls, represents 85% of the families who we contacted agreed to participate. So a truly community sample, rather than a high-risk sample, although we oversampled in the worst neighborhoods. So this is a summary of the assessments. So there are basically 4 cohorts. They're listed up here. 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7- and 8-year-olds. And then this is the ages at which they were assessed. As you can see here, the last assessments are basically the last full assessment, age 20. But I'm presenting data today up to age 19. So we interviewed parent and child yearly, and most of that was done at home. So that also allowed us to rate the family home, also do the observations of the neighborhood in which the family lived. Interviews, of course, and I'll tell you about the assessment in a moment, which is very extensive. But in addition, we obtained data from the teachers about the problem behaviors of girls. There are multiple measures of areas of measurements: individual, family, school, peer, and neighborhood. This is basically a psychosocial study. And what we see here, for example, all the different problem behaviors that girls may manifest are listed over here. And then family factors, as you're familiar with of many other studies, also school and peer factors, and health and neighborhood factors. So all of this in a kind of ecological framework of assessing the microcosm of the family, the school, the neighborhood, and interaction with the individual, of course. The retention of these studies, as you know, is really crucial, and this indicated here. As you can see, the retention actually stayed relatively stable, although this seems to be going down, but it's going down from basically 97% to 86 to 85 or 0.6%. So this really gives you an idea about the enormous care that was taken by retaining the sample. 85% or 86% is roughly the maximum that we also could do in the Pittsburgh youth study on boys. Now, the first topic that I'm going to deal with is girls' development of problem behaviors and delinquency. So again, thinking about the session this morning, we are very familiar with problem behaviors that boys do, and girls have very similar problem behaviors in some ways, but what is different often is the developmental distribution, so to say. So here you can see truancy as reported by teacher, parent, and child, And this basically shows the enormous increase in truancy between ages 10 to 15 and going down a little bit after that. What about self-reported violence? Of course, many of you are interested in violence, and this includes attacking someone with a weapon, hitting someone, robbing with force, throwing something at someone, involved in a gang fight. Although the individual prevalences of these items varies, of course, but as you can see here, the age, basically an age crime curve with a peak around age 14 to 15. As you remember, the age crime curve is earlier for girls than for boys. Why that is not clear. I mean, this is one of the major questions that we need to answer. But we're finding that here in the Pittsburgh Girls Study as well. Now, among those aggressive behavior, assaultive behavior was the most common that we recorded. And as you can see, the assaultive behavior kind of accelerates basically from age 11 to 12 onwards, again peaking around 14 to 15, continuing up to age 17 for sure. Now, the total offenses is represented here. So irrespective of whether it's violence, theft, and so on, as you can see here, again, the peak is 14 to 15 to 16. Now, what is different here with this picture is it no longer refers to prevalence, but to frequency. So the frequency of offending. So that's indicated here on the left-hand side, the number of offenses. And as you can see here, that whereas the number of offenders, this is active offenders, so in other words, individuals who do offend, peaks slightly again in this center part in mid-adolescence, but so does the frequency of offending. So the age crime curve, it's very necessary to dissect in both prevalence and frequency, as you can see here. So not all behaviors peak as neatly as I've shown you so far. And I would just want to emphasize drug dealing. And we know that from males as well, drug dealing actually doesn't conform very well to the age crime curve for males or females. As you can see here, it kind of almost linearly proceeds, basically accelerating from age 13 onwards to age 19. Now, what about criminal careers? So most girls, of course, are non-offenders, and the number of one-time offenders, as you can see here, is basically 22%. Out of that active group, 78% are recidivist. I want to kind of, the non-chronic offenders, there's less than 5 offenses, is about half of all the active offenders. But very importantly, criminal careers are not necessarily short, and this is indicated here, criminal career duration of 5 or more years. There are basically almost 20% of the girls that qualify for relatively long criminal careers. So some highlights of these results. Of course, as we all know, most females are not offenders. For violence, we found that the typical age crime curve with the prevalence of offending gradually increasing from age 11 to peak at ages 14 to 15. And moderate and serious theft, we also found a peak age at that same age, basically 15 to 16, and then a decline. So violence peaks earlier than theft. In contrast, the prevalence of drug dealing almost linearly increased. And what we found for frequency of offending is that the frequency of self-reported offending by active offenders increased in an almost linear fashion from age 11 to 19. So the duration of these careers, for many girls, the delinquency career was very short. 1 in 5 of the active offenders only committed a single offense between ages 11 and 19. But the average criminal career for those who started offending between age 11 and 14 was almost 3 years, compared to less than a year for those who started offending between ages 15 and 19. So here we see something we've, of course, documented in males as well, that this early onset of offending is correlated with a longer delinquency career. So in that sense, the data, again, conform with what is already known. So what about developmental types? You remember trajectory analysis. Now the trajectory analysis for males and females actually differ, as we know from reviews by, for example, Alex Picaro. That is, usually there are fewer trajectories for females than for males, and this is exactly what we have found. So here you see in red, high rate offenders, you see the age crime curve, well represented, and a flatter one, a flatter curve that is for low rate offenders, and then in black, the non-offenders. So basically, this is something that is fairly clear in terms of the classification of individuals on the basis of trajectories. You always should think, though, that the classification on the basis of trajectories can change. This is not a final word. Every time when you add one or more data waves, the classification is bound to change. So this is considered kind of preliminary data. What about the gender differences in these trajectories? I just wanted to contrast the boy study, so it says PYS, is the Pittsburgh Youth Study, and then on the right-hand side is the girls study. And as you can see here is that basically the non-offender group is, depending on the cohort in the boys study, is somewhere between 50% and 59%. But of course, the non-offender group is much higher for the girls, not surprising. Now, if we now look at high rate offenders on this line here, you see that the high rate offenders for the boys vary between 15 and 21%, and it's only 6% for the girls. Again, this is something we would expect. Consider this not a very surprising finding. However, it's very, very important to us, and I'll show you later why, is to actually identify these girls, you know, and say, okay, is there something special about these girls? So doing this, consider this as preliminary work to firm up pursuing the nature of the high rate offending girls. Now, the study also sheds light on the relationship between self-report and official records of offending. As you know, that those two actually are not the same, but also we have to ask ourselves how many self-reported offenses are committed, for example, for each police contact. So now this picture somehow was, because of the transformation in the system, this picture is totally screwed up. But basically what you see here is that about 30% of the girls actually had a police contact by age 17. The reasons for the contacts vary tremendously. As you can see them, they're listed underneath here, and they vary from vandalism to robbery and theft. So you can see that robbery and theft, assault, and curfew violations are really the most common reasons for police contact. Now, what about these hidden delinquency? Because what is apparent in the police context or the justice context in general is of course a fraction about how many offenses are actually committed according to self-reports. And this is called the scaling up factor. And this is a set of analysis we've done with David Farrington. In the girl study, we found that for every girl charged by the police for violence and theft combined over the ages 12 to 17, there were on average almost 3 girls who self-reported offending but were never charged. So the detection by the police is quite well substantiated here. That is the lack of detection. Also, for every offense rendering a police charge, 4 offenses were not detected. So it's not only the number of individuals, but it's also the number of offenses that we can document here that are basically hidden from the official records. The major implication, of course, is that the results based on delinquency outcomes, that is police contact or justice contact, conviction, and so on, actually tap into a much smaller population than the actual delinquent girls. Girls' self-reported violence and police contacts are overrepresented in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods. This is not surprising. It also happens for males, of course, but it's very important for us to document that the concentration of female offenders is geographic in certain neighborhoods and not in other neighborhoods. Lastly, I'm going to talk about high rate offending and early onset girls. We found basically a small group of chronic offending girls who was responsible for a large number of delinquent acts. 1 in 10 of these delinquent girls committed 10 or more offenses and accounted for 3/4 of all offenses. So here, we have basically a high rate offender, but there are, if you look at the gender volume of crime, the gender equivalent term, that is, the results agree. These findings was reported by Kempf, Leonard, and colleagues, who documented that a small proportion of life course persistent female offenders accounted for a large proportion of all adult crime. Now, the question is really whether that's different for males and females. I'm not going to tell you the full answer because I'd like you to read the book, but it's documented there. And we basically can make the comparisons with males. So the question really, perhaps also for the discussion later, is are the high rate offending girls different than the high rate offending boys? We also found, as I mentioned a little earlier, that early onset is important in terms of the later chronic offending. And here the results basically replicate those of males. Adolescent onset of offending is not necessarily, early onset it is not necessarily temporary or benign. So other studies summarized by Fontaine show that females whose onset of delinquencies in adolescence can also present adjustment problems in adulthood. So there's something about the early onset that is important, but it doesn't mean that it is a good predictor of later outcomes. And certainly, if we take onset in adolescence, the negative outcomes associated with that still prevail. So, also, I want to point out to you that in the reviews of delinquency by females, there is a late onset offender group, onset in adulthood. Now, whether that group is actually low self-reported offending in adolescence is unclear. But I just wanted to point out to you that there's a higher degree of late onset offenders among females than in males. Thank you very much. Is this yours? Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Kyle Treiber. I work on the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study. Well, let's get that up the way. There we go. And it is likewise a longitudinal study. It's a random population sample, so we have males and females in the sample. And I'm going to talk a little bit today, not just about the relationship between the crime involvement of the males and females and what the differences are that are there, but actually try to put forward that there are perhaps ways that we can understand this. One of the things that we work with in the Center for Analytical Criminology in Cambridge, where I work alongside Professor Rolf is the situational action theory. And this is the theory that we've put forward as a general theory of crime. And so I want to look today at how this theory can perhaps help us understand some of these differences that we see in the patterns of male and female criminality. And the title of the paper is it really the same difference? Because as I'll show, the theory is pretty consistent in explaining both the patterns we see in the male and the female offending. And then I want to talk a little bit at the very end about some of the differences that are still there, and of course where we can go from there in the future. So Rolf has just laid out very clearly, and as we are all very familiar with, there are differences in involvement of males and females in crime, and this is differences in prevalence as well as in rates of frequency. However, that said, we know that the majority of males are not heavily involved in crime, as are the majority of females. So we know that gender itself is not the explanative of a crime. It's not causing that offending to happen. There is something about males that makes them more likely to offend, but it does not, in fact, the fact of them being male is not what is causing them to offend. So this is some data taken from the study, and I'll come to the study and go over it in detail in a minute. But the idea here is to really illustrate the difference and to highlight the number and the percentage of males that are not getting involved in these heavy lives of crime. Now, as I'll show, both males and females are likely to have some involvement, but it's often very slight. Rolf's also showed that the majority of young people are involved in lower rates of crime, but there are some that go on to be more persistent. They're the ones who are often interested in trying to understand what the differences between those individuals are, because they're the ones who are responsible for a majority of the crime. But as this illustrates, it's not because they happen to be male or female. So what is it because of? The situational action theory argues that to understand, obviously, the differences between male and female crime, we want to understand crime itself. We want to understand what it is that leads individuals, whether they're male or female, to see crime as an option. And we start with the idea that crime is a form of rule breaking. And that's quite helpful because a lot of times we struggle to understand what it is that all crimes have in common, and therefore what kind of common explanation could we possibly have for all these various types of crime that have been defined by the law or could be defined by the law. We know that varies over time and across different jurisdictions. Rule breaking, however, doesn't vary. All acts of crime at all places at all times break the rules. So if we can explain why people break rules or why they see rule breaking as something they might do and why they choose to do it, then perhaps we can explain all acts of crime. Now, SAT posits that the way that we can explain this is by looking at why people see crime as an option and why they choose to commit it, so this perception choice process, and trying to understand then what the key individual and environmental factors are that may lead people to see rule breaking as an option in certain kinds of contexts, and then, of course, ultimately to choose it. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details of situational action theory. It's detailed elsewhere, but I will give you the kind of foundations of it. So when we're looking at the main theory, it's very much about interaction. So the key argument is that it's not just about people and their propensities, their individual characteristics, but it's about the interaction between those characteristics and the characteristics of the environments to which people are exposed. Now again, remember we're looking at rule breaking, so we're interested in what characteristics of people are likely to influence their tendency to see and choose crime, and likewise, what characteristics of settings are likely to influence the people who take part in those settings to see and choose to commit acts of crime. So from the individual perspective, we talk about crime propensity as being determined to a significant degree by individuals' rules, the rules that they themselves believe in about action. And we talk about these as the moral rules, but they're effectively what people think is right or wrong to do. And then also the ability to exercise self-control, which is something, of course, in criminology we're all very familiar with, the idea of self-control being important. It is indeed important in situational action theory because self-control allows you to act in accordance with those personal rules if you get tempted to do otherwise by the context that you're spending time in. However, it is important that you first see crime as an option in the first place. Otherwise, controls are irrelevant. So in the situational action theory, controls are situationally relevant, conditionally based on the need for control. And of course, then the ability to exercise self-control is only then activated when you need to exhibit control. And that control will come when there's a conflict between what you think is the right thing to do, what the setting is encouraging you to do, and also what the setting is telling you is the right thing to do. And that's the other half of the equation, is the setting itself. So we talk about the moral context. Just like the individual, we're looking at the rules that are relevant to a setting. Different rules apply in different settings, but also they're enforced to different degrees in different settings. So those are the key situational or setting contexts that we would look at. And then we would see the interaction of the two, the individual's rules, the rules of the setting coming together to influence how people see options for action, whether they might consider breaking a rule, and then how they go to choose it. And then self-control, deterrence, which is, of course, external control, may come into that choice process as well. So these are the key factors I want to look at. And if we apply this to the idea of gender, then, the idea is that there may be differences in males and females and their tendency to see and choose crime as an option. And so we would predict that this may come from differences in their propensity, so maybe their personal morality, their ability to exercise self-control, or the settings that they are exposed to, the moral context that they spend time in, the level of enforcement of rules in those settings, and importantly, the interaction of the two. So how individuals converge with those settings and how the interaction then leads to that perception choice process. Now, this is the situational model, so this is looking at the point of action, but of course, there are lots of processes that occur prior to this that determine whether individuals have certain characteristics, so whether they develop certain personal morality, certain abilities to exercise self-control, and also come to be exposed to certain kinds of settings, so settings where crime may be encouraged or discouraged to different degrees. So these are what we look at as developmental processes. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the developmental processes today, because first we need to understand the situational concepts, and then we can move back to discuss and look at how those situational factors come about and come together. But it's certainly an area of interest, and we've started to look into that a bit. All right, so that is the framework that I want to try to test. I want to try to understand if that framework will help us to explain the differences we see in male and female crime involvement. And I'm going to run this using data from the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study, or PADS+. Now, this study is ongoing since 2003, when we interviewed the parents of the young people in the study. As I mentioned, there's a random population sample. We had 716 young people taking part in the first wave. And as you can see, up to wave 8, which was finished at the end of 2015, we still had 91% of our young people taking part. So Rolf has already discussed the importance of retention, and we've taken that very seriously ourselves. As you can see, for the first 5 waves, we interviewed the young people every year. So we got retrospective data from the parents and baseline data in that first interview, and then we saw the young people. And I'm going to detail for you what those interviews entailed. But this is the data I'm going to look at today. So I'm going to focus on ages 13 to 17. That's because a lot of life changes occur after this point. We also end up with gaps because we started interviewing the young people at larger intervals. So rather than having to deal with some of those complexities, I'm going to focus on the adolescent period. Of course, adolescence is also the time where we're seeing the peak in crime involvement. So it's certainly the time period of most interest for the questions I'm looking at today. So we interviewed these young people, as you can see, 8 different waves. You can also see we have 2 community surveys, and I'm going to pull on some data from that as well. So each community survey is a survey of the city of Peterborough itself. We break the city down into output areas, which are the smallest census units that we have in the UK. They're much smaller than US census blocks, which are often used for these kinds of studies. So they have about 300 residents or 120 households per output area. And that's to try to get as close as we can to the actual environment that affects somebody during action. And then we ask the residents in those areas about factors of their social environment. And the key ones that we're going to look at today have to do with collective efficacy, which is a combination of social cohesion and informal social control. And the nice thing about collective efficacy is it provides a really nice indicator of the moral context that I mentioned. So we want to try to tap into settings where there are rules and that these rules are enforced. And so social cohesion has shared rules, and informal social control suggests that those rules are being enforced. So we'll use that measure in combination with some others to look at our exposure to those moral contexts, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So we had 2 community surveys, one in 2005, one in 2012. They covered about 6,000 residents each and had a good spread across the city, so we can look at each of those tiny areas closely. So the nature of the data that I'm going to look at from the individual interviews is, of course, designed to test SAT specifically. So one thing we really needed to do is we needed to be able to study individuals. So we have lots of measures for getting individual data, but their environments, and the community survey is one aspect of that. And then importantly, we needed to be able to look at how the two come together. So we needed to understand how our young people and young people with different types of propensities would encounter these different settings with different criminogenic characteristics. So to do that, we used a space-time budget. The space-time budget is a time diary, and we asked young people at each interview to tell us about 4 days in the previous week. Each day, we asked them for each hour where they were, and that's actually a geocode that can be linked to those small areas I just mentioned, so we can associate the data with the data from the small area community surveys, as well as the census and also land use data. Then we asked them who they were with, what their main activity was, and we asked them about the place that they were at. Now, these are incredibly detailed bits of information. So when we talk about place, it may be a specific shopping center in Peterborough. It may be a specific park. It may be a specific part of their school, type of classroom. So very detailed. Same thing with activities. It may be what sport they are actually playing. And with friends, are they with one friend? Is that friend male? Or are they with a group of friends? Are those friends mixed? Are they with a guardian? Is it a parent? Is it a police officer? And so on and so forth. So incredible amount of detail in the data, which makes it really exciting to try to analyze and to really pull out and characterize these hours the young people are spending, and that is a measure of their exposure. For crime, of course, we have the standard self-report from the questionnaire. We also have official records, and we have self-report from the space-time budget, and I'll show you that at the very end, where we ask the young people in each of these hours over those 4 days, were you involved in an act of crime, and we get data on that. Now, just to give you some detail on the measures I'm going to look at today, for the self-report crime, it's traditional crime types I'll look at. We've got other crime types as well, but we're looking at your kind of traditional crimes for the young people, so burglary, both residential and non-residential, shoplifting, theft from others, assault, robbery, arson, vandalism. I'm going to draw on the questionnaire for looking at propensity. So we'll look at our measure of weak morality, which is a moral attitudes measure. How wrong do you think it is to do a number of different kinds of rule breaking, from very minor things to more serious things? There's 16 items in that scale. And then a measure, we have a self-control, quite a classic measure, 8 different items asking the young people if they agree or disagree with statements like, I think about the future, I like taking risks, I tend to act on the spur of the moment, etc. So we combine those in a scale for propensity. Again, I'm not going to show you a lot of the detail for this. It's been published elsewhere, and it's been validated in a lot of analyses. And it's probably fairly familiar. For the environmental measure, though, for the measure of criminogenic exposure, we get a little bit more complicated. So here's where we're using that space-time budget data. So this measure is a measure of the hours that young people spend. But remember, we're trying to characterize settings with a weak moral context. So there are areas, hours, in which young people are unsupervised with their peers, in areas with poor collective efficacy, or, using the land use data, if they're not in a residential area, we have an indicator for whether they're in a city or local center. And that's because we know that collective efficacy of residents is not a great measure for the moral context of those city and local centers, where there's lots of other people who are using the setting. But that those are indeed quite criminogenic contexts because they don't have that kind of strong informal social control and social cohesion. Now, the reason for that measure, we think, is it's quite a handy way of looking at that moral context, trying to tap into it, because we know that there isn't the enforcement by guardians who are there. We qualify it with data from the questionnaire on delinquent peers. So if the young people have delinquent peers, we ask how frequently are your friends involved in these different kinds of crime. Then we can use that as a qualifier to say this is time that they spent with their peers, and they have a considerable number of delinquent peers. So delinquent peers, we would argue, would reduce the moral context or weaken it, because his friends are likely to encourage crime involvement, or to lead the young person to potentially see it. As I mentioned, we have collective efficacy, the area itself, the rules, the social cohesion of the residents, whether they're going to enforce those rules. So it gives us a very specific and unique measure of exposure. And so that's what I'm going to use in the following analyses. So first off, just to look a little bit at the crime. Nothing new or surprising really here. We have significant differences between our males and females in their offending, both in terms of their prevalence of offending and in their crimes per offender. you can see that overall 70% of our young people reported a crime in ages 13 to 17, and there's a bit of a difference. The males, 76, almost 77% reported at least one crime in that time period, whereas for the females it was 64%, but still the majority on both. And then we see the mean number of crimes per offender. Our male offenders are committing more than twice as many crimes as our female offenders. And you can see then some of the statistics that we have and the breakdown of our sample. Now, if we break this down by crime type, we see similar patterns. The only thing that stands out here is that there's no real difference in minor theft. So minor theft is shoplifting and theft from a person. And here we don't see differences in the prevalence and no significant differences in the frequency. Otherwise, we see differences across all crime types: criminal damage, which is arson and vandalism; serious theft, which is burglary, robbery, and car theft or car crime, theft of and from a car. And then, of course, in violence as well, quite significant differences. So this is what we're trying to explain. Why do we have these huge differences? And we're arguing that it's not because of gender, it's because of propensity and exposure. So here's a look at the propensity measure. The numbers in the table are from across the 13 to 17 year range, but the charts are showing you the differences across those years. You can see that there are significant differences in propensity for the females versus the males, with the females having a lower crime propensity, so being less prone to seeing and choosing crime as an option. And this is true both that they have lower self-control at all points and stronger personal morality at all points in time as well, except for 2 points I've just left off the dots where the differences are not significant. Okay, so clearly there's differences in propensity. They're not huge, but they are consistent from the males and the females. Now remember my exposure variable, so this is our complex hours, time spent. So the criminogenic setting refers to those hours themselves, hours in unsupervised, unstructured activities with peers in areas of poor collective efficacy or local and city centers. And then we have the crime-prone peers element that I mentioned we use to qualify. So the exposure variable is the combination of the two. But here we see no significant differences. So as far as the exposure of these young people to these particular contexts, the only difference that you see comes up in criminogenic settings at age 15. And actually, in this case, the females had greater exposure than the males. So the difference seems to be driven more by propensity than by exposure, but of course, we're all about interactions in the model, so we'll build towards that. If we break our sample down now and try to look at groups by propensity and exposure, this can also help us get an idea of how the males and females are spreading out across these different groups. So here we've split it into 3 groups by standard deviation. So the high and low propensity are 1 standard deviation above or 1 standard deviation below the mean. So we end up with about 15% of the sample in each of those groups, and then I've split it by gender to look at the differences. As far as the propensity scores are concerned, the split seems to work nicely. You get the same propensity effectively. There's a slightly significant difference in the middle group. And this is because the distribution is slightly shifted so that males are a little bit higher than females in their general distribution. But the difference is very small. But what you can also see here is that the crime is still significantly different in all of those groups, both in terms of prevalence and frequency, except for the high propensity, where basically all of the high propensity offenders, whether you're male or female, were offending. And if we look similarly at exposure, it's a reasonably similar picture. There's more non-significant differences. Remember that exposure isn't really differentiating them as much, but we do still see some differences in crime, not at the low level, so much, but at the high level. And what you can see there, 100% of males and females who had high exposure, so again, over 1 standard deviation above the mean, were involved in crime. Also, if you look at the correlation on the side, and this is similar with propensity, apologies if I switched it before you could see that, but the correlation between exposure and crime, and similarly the same with propensity and crime for the males and females, is also similar. Okay, so we see that these relationships are similar for both males and females. So now we want to actually try to look at then how much can propensity and exposure explain the differences in the offending of the males and the females. So here, simple, straightforward regression model. There's lots of fun when you're trying to model interaction effects. This is the most clear way to do it, but we are looking at all kinds of different models and ways of looking at it. But this is also easier for us to interpret. So you can see, first off, in model 1, gender explains very, very little of the variance in crime involvement, so very small. So again, I started with the point that gender is not a cause of crime. And you can see that this is really not a very interesting variable when it comes to explaining those differences. If we then add propensity and exposure, however, we get a lot more of the variance being explained. As you can see in Model 3, the interaction effect is highly significant, and a very significant proportion, nearly 50% of the variance is being explained by including all these predictors in the model. Okay, and the gender coefficient has dropped, but when you're looking at interaction effects, the interpretation of that main effect is difficult to interpret. So I'll look a little bit later at the actual interaction effect and talk a bit about what we see going on, because gender isn't just completely disappeared from this model. I then split it just to look at the differences, to look to see, are these explainers having the same, being able to explain male and female offending in a similar way, and as you can see, they do. So we have, in both cases, propensity and exposure are significant, but in both cases, the interaction effect, once it comes in, exposure drops out as far as any main effect it has, and we're expanding about 50% of the variance. So the models look fairly similar. So this is all supportive of the argument that, one, propensity and exposure are more causally relevant for explaining crime involvement, or certainly can explain more of what's going on than gender can, but also that they are the same value for explaining male and female offending. However, if we look at our interaction chart, here we've got the females in red and the males in blue. What you can see is we have this nice interaction. As the exposure goes up, our solid lines are the high propensity, our dotted lines or dashed lines are the medium propensity, and our dotted lines are the low propensity. So you can see with exposure on the bottom, the low propensity are basically situation resistant. Whether they're male or they're female, they don't offend. They also aren't tending to be exposed to settings. There's interesting selection effects going on. And then for our high propensity, in both cases, there's a significant interaction where exposure really makes that crime involvement take off, and the medium is somewhere in between. But what's striking from this is that the females are still committing much less crime. So even though we looked at those differences in exposure and propensity in these groups, and these are the same groups we looked at before, so the standard deviation groups, we're still getting a different effect size. Now, there's a lot of work to be done to try to understand or explain that, but I wanted to look more closely at one thing that I think is a potential explanation, and that is the fact that exposure may be different. So our measure of criminogenic context may not be working the same way for males and females. So it may be more criminogenic for the males. The males are more likely in these kinds of contexts, defined as unsupervised with peers in areas with poor collective efficacy or city or local centers in unstructured activities. Maybe that's more criminogenic for the males than it is for the females. So I've taken those hours out. This is space-time budget data. So these are the crimes per 1,000 hours that are spent in those kinds of contexts, those criminogenic contexts. It's a bit complicated, but once I explain it, it'll probably make, hopefully, a lot of sense. The blues are the males again, the reds are the females. And the ones that have the dark line around them are the ones that are exposed. And I think you can see that exposure, it stands out quite clearly. It's when these young people are exposed that these outcomes occur. And these are our extra incidence outcomes. So we have outcome of drinking. Did they drink alcohol in that hour? Risk, were they involved in a risky situation? Did they witness a fight or harassment of some sort? And then victimization as well. And then the saturation of the line. So the darker red is the higher the propensity. Similarly, darker blue, the higher the propensity. And so the reason I'm showing you this is that the patterns are fairly similar for males and females. So we see females responding in a similar way, at similar rates, to exposure to these contexts when it comes to these kinds of outcomes. But if we look at crime, it's much different. So the females are not committing nearly as much crime when they're involved in these contexts. They don't seem to be as vulnerable to the settings. Now, this is all acts of crime we had in the space-time budget. So we can also separate that out. Violence and theft, and we see the same pattern. So it's not just because this is being driven by violence, for example. It's also a similar pattern with theft. Now, this is preliminary. There's a lot more to look at here, a lot more to explore. But I think it's very interesting to think about the fact that this measure we have of criminogenic context may not mean the same thing for females that it does for males, and that may help to explain some of the differences in their crime involvement. So overall, in conclusion, we can say that situational action theory does appear to be useful. Crime propensity and exposure do appear to be helping explain some of the differences in male and female offending. But there's still something that is different, and it may be that things that are wrong for females are more wrong in some of these contexts than they are for males. And that makes sense if we think about the way that rules are enforced and the expectations for rule following that are perhaps different for males and females and different in these kinds of contexts. So crime may be more wrong for females if we're measuring the criminogenic context in the same way, which of course we are in this case. So future directions, certainly I want to explore further this concept of criminogeneity, this aspect of exposure, and to look to see if there are ways of trying to explain it, trying to find ways that the data can speak to these differences. And our data, as I said, is very detailed, so hopefully it can. And then another step is to, of course, explore further where these differences in propensity and exposure may emerge. Now, we didn't find any significant differences in exposure between the males and females, but certainly propensity we did. And there's certainly lots of interesting things that we can explore to see why females may be more likely to develop a stronger personal morality or a greater ability to exercise self-control. We also want to look at the distribution, of course, between the two different genders to see how that plays out as well. And that is where we're heading in our next analyses, but I will save that for another time. So thank you very much.
So as I mentioned, Dr. Leena Augimeri was unable to come to Stockholm, so I will try to perform as well as she would have been, which is a great task. She's a very quick and fast talker, and it's a bit of a challenge for me to really represent her work. But it's very important to actually understand. I'm going to throw some water here. To understand self-control. And this has been mentioned this morning, as you heard in the opening session. It also has been mentioned several times by Dr. Treiber. And self-control, of course, is a key issue for the development of delinquency in many of the delinquency theories. Take, for example, Hershey's theory. So the question then is, can self-control be improved? And this is really where Leena Augimeri and her team has made big inroads in terms of developing interventions for young people below age 12 to improve their self-control. Most of this has been published on males. In Pittsburgh, by the way, we did a controlled trial, and we showed that indeed the training, as stipulated by Leena and her team, significantly could decrease uncontrolled behavior, improve control in young men. Now, for girls, this has not yet been done in a systematic way, but we're going to talk about the girls today as evidence because data is being collected about girls. So let me start with the first picture here, and that is about up to 20% of children experience disruptive behavior, and of the 8-year-old children, about 40% with conduct disorder are repeatedly convicted. So this sets the stage of things, also a theme that was mentioned this morning. And here also underneath you'll see the cost of crime. I think because of the water that was spilled by me, the computer is not working. Could I have some help, please? I think it needs restarting.
It doesn't work with that one.
No, it doesn't. I put this here, and it wasn't flat enough.
It seems like something.
Okay, I effectively destroyed the machine here.
But it's restarting now, so.
It is restarting, okay. And it says automatic repair. So let's see if this works.
Press enter to try again. Det kom lite vatten på här. Det är helt plötsligt.
Yeah, I think it's better not to. Yes.
Jag gick och hämtade papper. Ska jag gå och hämta mer papper?
Ni får fixa din dator helt enkelt.
Ja. Men jag går och hämtar trappa och så.
Okay, while the repair is going on, perhaps I can ask you to, if you're really interested in Dr. Augimeri's presentation, to write her, because I'll give you the email later. Because obviously the equipment is not working. Can I just ask Professor Lösel perhaps to take over and give some comments on the first two papers? Thanks. Yes.
You come back later, or it's very wet here. So, do we have some tissues somewhere?
No,
Or I have something. Oh, we are flooded now. So,
I can give you all the tissues that I have.
I have a few, but I think I hold in my hand. Is it working again?
No, the computer is broken.
Yeah.
Broken. Perhaps you can do it with a fan so it gets warmer.
Yes. We have the presentation because
Do we have it on a stick, Rolf?
I do.
Or should
Yeah.
we have to.
I think what I can do to save time at first to make
that's a good
a
idea.
few general comments, and then when we hear about Leena's, then I can make some more specific. So thank you very much for a very interesting session, 2/3 of a very interesting session. By chance, this topic of female delinquency and development is currently very important in my own life as well, because we are doing in parallel in the Erlangen-Nuremberg development and prevention study that is now going on over 12 years. We are currently working also on different trajectories, and we find some differences between the boys and the girls over time. Another, by chance, event was that last week at the Nigel Walker lecture in Cambridge, Candace Grutschnitt gave a talk on issues of female delinquency in developmental trajectories. And I'm currently, or the new chair of the Division of Developmental and Life Course Criminology of the American Society of Criminology. And this group has recently also brought out a special issue of the Journal of Developmental and Life Course Criminology on gender differences. And I highly recommend you to join this division. I'm now advertising. It's only $10 a year, and you get the electronic version of the journal for free. So if you are already an ASC member or interested in becoming an ASC member, join Developmental and Life Course Criminology. Is really worth, it's good value for money. So this is, in my view, something that need also to be explained. Why are we currently in various parts of research in countries so interested in gender differences? For many years, the males were enough. They were the violent and the criminal majority, and girls were not so much, or females were not so much of interest. Of course, it may have to do with generally more interest in gender differences in all parts of life, also in work life and so on. It may have to do that delinquency and crime of females is increasing in various countries. It may have also to do that movements, feminist movements, now alert more than before that we often do not have the more specific services for females available. This is, for instance, also in another area where I am working, in adult criminality and treatment of offenders. It's a problem because the females are often so few, so they cannot develop programs and also not do sound evaluations of the program. So we have various reasons why there is currently more interested in girls. For instance, in my country, there are only one social therapeutic institution for female offenders and for young female offenders, but we have a number of these institutions for boys and for adult men. Should I say anything more, or do you want to go now, Rolf?
No, why don't you finish?
Okay. I have also something on Leena's, then I do it later.
Yeah, sure.
And as Rolf rightly mentioned, we know pretty much about the differences between boys and girls or males and females in delinquency. We do not know so much yet, and also these presentations have shown, about the reasons. Kyle has shown some reasons, propensity, morality, and so on. But of course, they do not explain the full range of differences. And there's still a debate out. Why are these differences in prevalence there, and also differences in development? Socialization theories, girls are more educated to conform to norms, and your result may be a consequence of that. Evolutionary factors that females, this comes also from the resilience research I am involved in, are a little more resilient, protective. This may have to do with hormonal changes they are adapted to. It may have to do with visibility of the offenses. For instance, as Rolf has shown, the scaling up process. Girls must be more antisocial to get under the radar of the police. They must have more antisocial acts or offenders. This is an important issue. It may also be this case when girls become violent, boys do not report, or males. We know from domestic violence studies that the women are as aggressive and violent as the men in frequency, but when they harm the man, this is not nice for a man, he does not report to the police, or the wounds are not so severe as when the man hits the wife. So there are a recent study also from Olivia Choi from Adrian Rain's department in criminology shows there is a heart rate difference, resting heart rate difference, and this is an indicator, as we may know, for arousal processes. Arousal is again related to impulsivity and sensation seeking. It may be that this relatively, it's only a difference in means, arousal of males may explain some of the biological differences between males and females that further then lead to differences in antisocial behavior and crime. Or as some traditional explanations where girls are mainly antisocial or difficult when they have been abused. There is a trend, but as Cassie Spatz-Whittem had shown in her studies, it is also a negative effect on boys, and the effect is also not so strong as some people think. So the issue of development is that Rolf emphasized in his talk, and this is the reason behind this session, is in my view very important. And we heard 2.25 of studies until now that are highly important. They have a number of strengths, and I'm really impressed. Of course, I know the Peterborough study and I know the Pittsburgh study to some degree, but it's really impressive. These studies have large samples. They have high retention rates, as it was shown. They have multiple measurements, multiple informants. This is a very important issue because often we have only one measurement, and questionnaire scales normally intercorrelate even when they are measuring rather different things. And we have different informants, and we know from research that different informants do not agree so much. The correlations are only 0.30 or so. And we have different countries, and we also have included, until now not fully shown, a study on interventions that can be a better, not only practical application, but a better test of the relevant mechanisms that lead to different developments in males and females in delinquency. The Pittsburgh study of Rolf is, to my knowledge, the largest study on girls. He did not present here now the boy study, but I know some of the results, so I can make some comments on that. Overall, Rolf's study and his colleagues, they have clearly shown there are a lot of similarities between the development in antisocial behavior of girls and boys. But overall, the level is higher, and there are also some differences. For instance, in my view, an important result is the increase in antisocial behavior or in delinquency is a little earlier than in boys. Why? This may have to do with puberty. It's earlier. It may have also to do that the younger girls, when they are in early youth, they have often boyfriends that are a little older, and the boyfriends, unfortunately, some of the very antisocial boyfriends are attractive to young girls, so they may get reinforced in doing bad things by these boys. It may have other reasons as well. We do not exactly know, but the results are similar to what we had already some years ago here in Sweden. Håkon Stadin did a study on this topic and also found these early startings that may have partly to do with the social, not the wider context, but with specific contacts with specific boys, and also with earlier puberty. What I also found is an interesting result is the scaling up that you mentioned, and Aronson and Rolf Loeber have shown in a study that they get only or more frequently to the attention of the police when they have done more serious acts. This may have to do with the facts that girls are a little more on average depressive, shy, and so on, and this is why this may not be as visible as in boys. And we also know from school studies that 2/3 of the so-called difficult students or pupils are boys, and only 1/3 is among the girls, is female. Where are we? Sorry. Here we are. The finding of fewer trajectories that Rolf reported, this is also something that seems to be rather consistent. Also, not all have only C3, some have 4, and so on. And we in our study find also some differences in the trajectories. And we started already at age 4.5 years and going up to age 14 to 15 now. And there are some differences, not dramatic differences, in the trajectories of boys and of girls. Where are we? Here. The lower rate of high-intensity offenders or antisocial youngsters among girls is plausible, but we still need more explanation of that, and some explanations were given in Rolf's studies and some also in Kyle's study. Interesting. I have it here on my sheets for the comment. You did not really present it. I got Rolf's presentation already on Saturday or so, so I can mention it. What is interesting, you refer to the book, they should read it. anxiety and depression, what is more characteristic internalizing problems for girls, remain relatively stable during the younger adolescence, between 7 and 11 years. And it may increase later, and this is what we know from girls' problematic behavior developments. It starts later, and then in the later adolescence, they have more of these problems, plus eating disorders and so on. A particularly interesting finding is, in my view, that again, as in boys, the drug dealing does not follow the age crime curves. This may have to do with social influence of gangs or whatever. It may have also to do not only with drug dealing, but also with drug consumption. But a real good explanation I have not available at the moment. Interesting is that the anxiety seems to have something like a protective effect against early starting. But we know from some other research, from David Farrington, for instance, and I think Rolf was also a co-author, that later on, when a youngster became already delinquent, then comorbidity with serious internalizing problems may lead to continuity of problems, a clear indicator how important it is to look at different age phases, and the same variables may have a different effect, sometimes a protective, sometimes a risk effect. But the studying of protective factors is extremely difficult. A few words on, so overall I think Rolf's study shows a substantial amount of similarity, but some important differences in the development of boys and girls in youth, in antisocial and delinquent and other forms of externalizing problems. Kyle's study, I think, partially or substantially, or PO and Kyle's study agrees with the Pittsburgh study on girls, although the mean amount of self-control is lower and morality is lower in the girl sample. The relations to the outcome are overall similar. Interesting, self-control remains relatively stable over adolescence, but the weak moral rules increase also in girls, not only in boys. What is, in my view, one of the most important findings of your study is that this problematic context, so exposure, even when it is high, seems to be not to have a similar strong impact on girls than on boys. This reminds me to an old study, I think, of P.O. and Rolf long ago about protective factors in your Pittsburgh study that has shown that if only those who do not have so strong propensity or family problems and so on, that they may have a higher risk in high problematic contexts, as far as I think I remember correctly, okay, because I have quoted this study in one of my papers and I have really read it at this time. Why do these girls seem to be able to have some more protective mechanisms in place and do not have the steep increase as we have in boys? We have not yet a convincing explanation for that. Maybe that the family is a little more supervising and controlling. I think you have data and can assess this. You by yourself asked also, why are these experience or feelings of wrongness different in similar context for different people? Gender may be an important moderator of that. And the last, sorry, it also got a little wet. I found the amount of variance explained by gender in the Peterborough study surprisingly small. It was only, 2% or so. If we look to violent crime, in some areas, the differences are much larger. One to 6, for instance, is the prevalence of the rates in official crime statistics and also in some self-report studies, it may have to do that gender, I would not say PO, please, I would not say gender is the cause, but of course the amount of differences in some areas of crime is much stronger. So gender explains in technical terms more amount of variance than it is in your study that has a stronger focus, I think, on not so extreme crimes, what we always have when we are studying delinquency, and in particular when we do it in interviews or questionnaire. I think only a few studies, the Pittsburgh studies, they had some murder later on. There is a book on this topic. Let me emphasize that the difference between Rolf's study and the Peterborough study that was presented here, both, is indeed that the Peterborough study has a stronger focus on explanation with the situational action theory. However, if I take this interaction of exposure and interaction with propensity, one needs to mention that the sound theoretical concept of PO and his colleagues of morality and self-control, at the end, when it comes to interaction between both, it leads to a construct where we are not surely aware what it is. Let's think about a person who has high moral orientation and very low self-control. And as you know from studying assessment in psychology, it may be the same score as 2 middle scores, and then it is difficult to interpret. So it's similar as the aggregation of risk factors, but it has a clearly stronger causal orientation. I personally think what the studies, both studies have shown, that there are many similarities but differences, but some of the differences need further explanation, particularly as Kyle has said at the end, why the propensity is still so different between both genders. And so a lot has to be done further, and now I'm waiting for Rolf's presentation. I have a few comments on Leena later on, but if you can present, it would be good.
We are running out of time.
We are running out of time?
Yeah. Minutes. So, obviously, this accident with the water played foul in terms of the presentation for today on Leena Augimeri's. But I wanted to go back to the end of her presentation so that you can make a note about her email. And it's, let me see for a moment what it is. So that you can actually ask for a copy of her presentation. And so it's Augimeri at childdevelop, develop.ca, Canada that is. And I strongly suggest that you ask her for information about the treatment of boys in terms of improving their self-control. I think this is truly pioneering work, and I'm sorry that we have to show you only just the first and the last slide of her presentation. But I just want to have a few minutes for the audience to ask questions. And I wanted to, before I do, I wanted to thank Professor Lösel for his brilliant conceptualization and his summary of what he thinks are the really truly important issues behind the first 2 presentations. So, are there questions from the audience? Everyone is, yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Curiosity has forced me to ask you this question. The thing you said we can read about later in the book about. Yes. Maybe right. There's a possibility for you to expand a little bit on that. topic about differences behind girls' development.
Right. One of the most remarkable findings, actually, so far in the Pittsburgh Girls Study is to ask the question, within each gender, who is what percentage of girls or boys is responsible for, roughly 75% of all crime reported for each gender. So this is an important issue because most of the time we are kind of obsessed by gender differences, but we have to ask ourselves, if there are frequently offending boys or girls, who is actually responsible for most of the crime, and within that gender, and remarkably, that percentage actually is larger for girls than for boys. So different than we had expected. But it fits also with several other findings, and that is, if you go to treatment centers for girls, you find that staff usually report it's much more difficult to treat girls than boys. And if you ask researchers about the burden that girls have compared to boys in terms of risk factors, you'll find something similar, and it's called the gender paradox. And that is the gender with the lower prevalence actually can be much more affected by negative events in life. So, for example, girls tend to have fewer birth defects than boys, early in life, of course. However, girls who have birth defects have a much lower chance of survival. There are numerous other examples in medicine about this gender paradox. And the gender paradox, I think, applies also to girls that we are concerned about today. Now, why that is a big question. But the example I gave you about, within the gender differences for looking at who is responsible for most of the crime is a good example. Any other question? Yes, there's a question in the back.
Thank you very much for this. I could perhaps add one, when you asked why it's so few females with criminal behavior, we thought long ago perhaps females are acting within more private areas. And that's also what Friedrich talked about, that males will not tell or accuse. It's an area within the home and among the children and within the sexual area. So I wonder if you have any thought about that, or if you have seen something like that in your studies, since we also find that females who are drinking very much and also violent acting, they are very, in personality aspect, they are very different from other girls, non-criminal girls. And that is something we don't see among males. They are very specifically different.
I think that's a very important issue that you raise, and it hooks in also with what Professor Lösel said. And there's a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, less delinquency development for girls in general than for boys. However, the mental health problems, particularly anxiety and depression, tend to increase. Eating problems, PTSD is very much more common in girls than boys. So we have to ask ourselves about the total picture of health and mental health over time. traumatization, the effects of traumatization, all the things that I'm sure you're very familiar with. So in the longitudinal data sets like Pittsburgh, and I presume also Peterborough, much work remains to be done on looking at the total configuration of both protective and risk factors, but also in the context of the manifestations of health and mental health. I think the equation is not simple, as you can imagine. It's not just a question about, trying to explain away gender differences in delinquency. There are many other differences, and the fact that delinquent girls have a higher propensity of suffering from other problem behaviors as they develop into adults is really a question that we need to address in the future analysis. Is there something you want to say?
Yeah, we'll try to. Can you hear me? Oh, that's better. Okay. For our study, we haven't yet analyzed. We have data on mental health. We haven't looked at that in detail with gender. But when we've looked at the situational analysis, so the exposure, the propensity, what we see on those females who are offending is that they are converging with the males. So they're very similar in exposure and propensity, and some of that I've showed you today. So from what we've looked at, although they may be different from some other females, it seems like they're just moving to the same place as far as their situational experiences as the males who are offending. And so we see similarities with males rather than so much highlighting the differences between them and the other females. So if we look at the males who aren't offending, likewise we find similarities with the females who aren't.
Any other question, please? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. I did wonder because one of your slides, you were talking about the different types of crimes that were committed by the boys and the girls, and one of them was ungovernable. Now, I do wonder if that's not also a part of what the commentary also said, that sometimes it's about invisibility and visibility of crimes committed by girls and by boys. So isn't ungovernable kind of a label that will possibly more easily be applied to girls who behave in a certain way, or, in respect to boys who are sort of in the boys will be boys scheme where they can be more violent?
So are you thinking who's doing the labeling?
Yeah.
But who would be doing labeling?
Well, I'm assuming the police in that case.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think your question also actually highlights one of the big limitations of longitudinal studies. It's basically following up individuals over time. That doesn't mean that we can examine in detail what each police officer actually thinks, or what ideas the person has about gender, the stereotypes or the lack of them. So unfortunately, that's a very important topic, but the most longitudinal studies can't address that. I think we reached 3 o'clock. I wanted to thank you for coming, and also I wanted to thank our other presenter, Dr. Treiber, and particularly Professor Lösel for his illuminating comments. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.